But this, in a single slide nutshell, is me and what I'm all about. As Jamin mentioned, I did my doctorate at QUT, which was in '99. I did a mass communications research degree in Leicester in '96, and I did my undergrad here in Toronto at Victoria College back in the '80s. And since the day I left my doctorate, I've been in the commercial world, in the private sector. I knew from the very beginning that I wasn't going to do a full academic career for a number of reasons we won't get into. That wasn't as interesting for me at the time. I was particularly fascinated by the idea of thinking profoundly about the banal. I really was interested in doing that. And so commercial semiotics was, in the end, the answer. Although it took me a good 8 months to realize that such a thing called commercial semiotics even existed. And that was 8 months of all my friends and family saying, what the hell do you think you're possibly going to do with that degree in the private sector? Just inconceivable. So, haha to all of them, in the immortal words of Nelson. So I now work on North American and global projects for a wide range of clients, and you probably recognize some of these guys. AB InBev own Labatt and Stella Artois and Budweiser, and a whole bunch of very big global brands we've worked on. Burger King, Kellogg's, Unilever, Pepsi, Nestle, Toyota, General Mills, they're all kind of big blue chip global clients, which takes us around the world on a lot of global work. I work as a project manager and a focus group moderator, but also an ethnographer, and as a commercial semiotician, probably in that order, quite honestly. I wish that semiotics were a larger part of what I do professionally, but it takes a huge amount of energy to convince clients to actually sink money into commercial semiotics. Unlike in Europe, where they commission it at the drop of a hat, here it's always a struggle. We have some projects. Sarah, who is also a commercial semiotician here, she's much more successful at it than I am, and if you're really curious about how that works, she's probably the person to talk to. Anyway, I've been teaching market research semiotics to the North American market community since 2002, always waving the flag on how fantastic it can be. And in my company, ABM, we're a big believer in triangulation, which is why we tend to throw semiotics into a triangulated research approach. When clients come to us with questions, they say, we really have no idea what X means, and we need to find out what X is. Our answer is generally, if we can, well, let's ask consumers about it, which is focus groups, but then let's also do some semiotics, which is desk-based. And you can't ask consumers about semiotics because the language is completely beyond them, which means you can sit at your desk and you can just be clever all by yourself. And that's a great, very satisfying thing to do. So let me tell you just briefly about commercial semiotics and the idea of market proof. And I'd like to start off by considering the sneaker. This is the kind of thing that comes up in commercial semiotics all the time. Oh yes, very calculated effect, right? The sneaker, right? You're all familiar? Normally I made a big impression. I usually slap my leg up on a desk and show everyone how limber I am, but I don't have a desk, so I'm just going to hold it out. This is the Converse, and they're a fashion statement, particularly in business environments. They say something about the wear, which is pretty standard fashion semiotics. They say things like, I'm not corporate or stuffy, I'm laid back, I'm a cool guy, I'm young, or at the very least I'm young at heart. I'm kind of past the stage where I can claim to be young, but I can still hold on to the idea of being young at heart. And in pure classic semiotic fashion, these are all meanings that are decoded fairly subconsciously. People rarely make very conscious conclusions about people's dress, shoe, or fashion choices. You just kind of instinctively know when you meet somebody who's made a decision to wear Converse instead of dress shoes that says something kind of casual and kind of accessible about them. The problem with that, of course, has to do with proof. Because in my line of work, everybody wants to know what the proof is. Where do these ideas come from? And we're always explaining to people that semiotics is a qualitative methodology, which is very different from quant. Quant is surveys and statistical significance. And there's a whole world of research called qualitative, which is kind of the touchy-feely emotional stuff. And semio is very much part of the qualitative world. And because of that, it generates hypotheses, in the same way the focus groups do. You don't know for sure that that's the truth about a brand, but you can get 25 people across the country to all bring up this idea, and that gives you a hypothesis that maybe in fact that notion is statistically significant. And as such, it's as much art as it is science. So when clients commission it, and sometimes they commission it as kind of a deep dive into creative input, they know they have to do something in this area, and they want to know what the area means and how it can be interpreted and what directions it can go in. And they know that they can't ask Joe Blow off the street to talk about that because people as a general rule are pretty stupid. They just have no idea about those kind of things. You really kind of need to dig in. And they get that analysis, and then they second guess themselves, because they realize that there is a large personal element to doing semiotic analysis, and they are concerned that what they're getting when they get semio is just personal feeling about what something means. So in those kind of cases, we have to offer some kind of proof that there is a system or a science or a reason behind why we say that converse, for example, are a denotation of hip, cool, laid-backness. So how, of course, would we do that in that example? We could do it academically, of course. It's possible to do that. We could wade into the textbooks, and we could wade online, and we could bring up all the citations and the footnotes and the years and all the publications and all that kind of stuff. But quite honestly, it's one of the reasons why I was quite content to leave academia almost 15 years ago, because I'm not especially excited by footnotes. If any of you are excited by footnotes, I apologize to you, because that's a terrible diss. I hope nobody is feeling that pain at the moment. Just me, personally, I'm not excited by footnotes. We prefer to take this kind of approach. So we would point out that Converse Chuck Taylors have a history. And the history starts with the early 1920s, where Chuck Taylor, and that's the name of the guy who's actually associated with these particular sneakers, he was a basketball player. And he sold Converse, because he wore Converse when he was playing basketball. That's him, I think, going up for the dunk. And you can see they're wearing Converse in these photos. He was then retained by the Converse company to sell Converse shoes, and he went around the United States and he sold Converse in the 1920s. 1920s, very clean-cut, very kind of crew-cut culture going on in the States at the moment. And that led it quite nicely to then be appropriated by punk rock and grunge bands like the Ramones, or by Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, as kind of ironic innocence. There was this lovely, very satisfying way of taking something that was very clean and clean-cut and very pure, and inserting it into heroin and filth and CBGB of the 1960s and 1970s New York. What fun is that? And the Ramones are famous for only ever being photographed in black high-top Converse. That was their thing. It was part of their image. Very constructed, but very much part of their image. And of course, Kurt Cobain was very much the spiritual progenitor. Progenitor, is that the right word?
Heir.
That's a much shorter word. The spiritual heir of the Ramones, and so he wore Converse. And in fact, the last known photograph of him, very sadly, having shot himself, is here with his Converse and kind of in the corner. So at that point, it then became appropriated by anyone who really wants to claim ideological kinship with the punk rock attitude of the punk rock movement. If you want to lay some line of connection between yourself and punk rock as an idea, an easy way to do that is to wear Converse. I have nothing against Avril Lavigne, who I'm sure is a lovely person in real life, but she is not punk rock. That is not what she is about. And yet, she kind of likes to pretend a little bit. She'll play that. She'll wear the shoes. But she's making a statement there. She may not make punk rock music, but she's claiming some kind of ideological connection there. No, fair enough. Another example I want to give you just briefly is the example of Xbox, which is an example, again, we took from an actual study of ours. We did a study years ago, and this is what the Xbox logo used to look like. This was an alcohol project we did, which included a peripheral semiotic analysis of the Xbox brand. It was a triangulated study, so we talked to consumers, we talked to people who actually played it. And part of it was this semiotic thing, which we did on the side. And one part of what was a peripheral study, so you can imagine now, this is two kind of levels of remove of importance as far as we were concerned, was that the Xbox brand is essentially feminine, which we kind of threw as a parting shot into the debrief, really. We talked about all the important things, and then as an aside, we said, well, obviously, Xbox brand is feminine, but we're sure you know that, and let's go on. And then, of course, they stopped us. They said, whoa, 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 feminine. Hang on a second now, what do you mean by that? So we explained a little bit more. We said, well, it was feminine, but it wasn't this kind of feminine. Depends on what you mean by the word feminine. It wasn't that kind of feminine. It's not what we were talking about, which is what we suspected the clients were thinking of. It was more like that kind of feminine, was the kind of idea of femininity we had. And in fact, more accurately, it was more kind of like this. You familiar with this film? Sucker Punch. Oh yeah. If you're into attractive women blowing up shit with automatic weapons, right? If that's your thing, because yeah, who's not? I mean, what's there not to like about that? Then this, I have to tell you, is the film for you. It's not a particularly good movie, I don't think, but as far as attractive women blowing shit up, it's awesome. This is like got everything it takes. Anyway, that's the kind of femininity. I mean, this is a kind of femininity that we were talking about that Xbox kind of communicates. But this was a problem. This is, in fact, a major problem. This caused the clients major dismay. It wasn't the point of the research that there was major dismay. They said, how dare you explain to us that our brand, which is really designed to appeal to 17-year-old teenage boys, could be feminine. And it actually threatened the plausibility of the entire project. They said, well, we think you've got that wrong. We think that's nonsense, quite frankly. And the fact that you've got that wrong makes us think, well, maybe you've got all of it wrong. Because if you're that wrong about something that's so clear to us, what kind of bullshit are you trying to spin here? It's kind of nonsense. So we had to roll our eyes a little bit, and in the end we decided, okay, so let's go back and do a proper market proof on the Xbox logo. So we started with this. You familiar with this film?
Yes.
1979, Ridley Scott, one of the great sci-fi classics of all time. And this is actually an award-winning movie poster for the brand. As far as movie posters have awards, I think it's a little odd that movie posters have awards, but apparently there are awards for movie posters, and in 1979, this won an award for movie poster. So if you're familiar with this, you'll see that this is a fairly accurate representation of what the movie's all about and one of the characters in the film. And then we said, so keep that in the back of your mind for a moment, think about that, and then to that idea, we'd like you to add this idea. Exactly right. This is the Matrix. Has anyone here in this room not seen the Matrix? All right, that's not bad. You're going to have some homework. You appreciate it.
I was too busy at the time when it came out.
So this, of course, is the Matrix. And I know most of you are either semioticians or have an interest in semiotics. So you can start to see now some consistency in the codes going on here. We talked a little bit about eggs, and we talked a little bit about colors. We pointed out that the alien symbol there is the egg, and the egg, of course, is arguably the most feminine icon in history. You would be hard-pressed, I think, to find something that was more feminine than the egg. And we said there's a lot of green going on in those two images as well. So we also need to think about green. What does the color green mean? What is the chromatology of green? Green, of course, means life, but this is strange green because it's neon green. And neon green is different. That's a little bizarre. What does it mean for a color to be neon? To make a color neon, you've got to run a current of electricity through it. That's kind of how you get neon, is you run electricity through color. So adding electricity to color changes the game quite seriously. It suggests modernity, because there are few things as modern as electricity. It's one of the defining characteristics of the modern age. We have electricity, so now you know you've left the kind of dark ages. So neon green means that this thing is alive, because we know green leaves life, but it's got so much electricity running through it, it can't really be human. It's got to be something else. It's not normal, it's not natural, it's probably artificial. It might be robotic, because electricity kind of suggests roboticism. It might be supernatural. It almost certainly wants to eat you and kill you, and not necessarily in that order. It might actually be the other way around, but there's got kind of involved there. And then to that we said, keep in mind also that we're talking about boxes, because it's the X box. Box is very crude slang for vagina, and the Xbox logo has a big X, which is kind of a crude gash or a slash in it, and both slash and gash are also very crude slang words for vagina. And then when you add the X to it, which is shorthand for sex, and you appreciate, of course, that hardcore pornography is 3 X's. If you've got pornography that's only 1 X or 2 X's, you're a dilettante. You're really not going hardcore. I mean, 3 X's for hardcore pornography, right? That's the kind of hardcore stuff. And then with about 40 minutes of pretty amateur PowerPoint cutting and pasting, we showed them this. We said, this is not a complicated thing to do, and we are not Photoshop artists. We basically took a photograph of the logo, and we cut it in half, and we inverted it, and when you do that, this is what it kind of looks like. And that, we felt, looks actually pretty similar to that. And if you know all of the denotations on the left, then putting all of the denotations of the right together are actually pretty straightforward. And then we told them, you know what, you don't really have to worry about it. The Xbox logo offers a black box that's got a slash or a gash, which reveals on the inside something that's alien in some kind of weird, scary way. It almost certainly wants to jump out and eat you, or kill you and eat you, because that's what the alien monster does. And any box that gives birth to a monster like that has to be feminine, because to our knowledge, only women give birth. And this is precisely the kind of feminine sexual death that your teenage boy market would die to achieve. We called it internally the vagina dentata Liebestod. You're familiar with these terms, of course, right? Liebestod is Wagner's love death. It's the idea of achieving perfect love through death. And the way that you do that, of course, is you're chewed up by the vagina dentata. If you are a 17-year-old boy, that's fantastic. That's kind of what you want. In no way would the femininity of the brand pose a barrier to 17-year-old teenage boys. Don't worry about it, it's perfect, it's just what they wanted. And they were a little uncomfortable with the idea of vagina dentata. Fair enough, because quite frankly, I think you're supposed to kind of be a little uncomfortable with the idea of vagina dentata. I think I would worry about you if you were comfortable with the idea of vagina dentata. So once they got over the idea of that, they were actually quite content. We said, you know, here's the math. You take the alien egg, and you add the matrix to it, you do a little bit of PowerPoint, and you end up with the Xbox logo. That is kind of classic market proof. And that we find is a much more satisfying way to prove semiotic analysis in the commercial world than footnotes or citations. So with that as background, I'd like to do a similar kind of thing with the complexity of white, because this is something that's come up recently, fairly frequently in fact, in our ongoing research. And so internally at ABM, we've spent a little bit of time thinking about this and debating it and having a lot of fun with trying to figure out exactly not only what it means and why, but then how do we actually demonstrate some marker proof on how it actually plays out. So it started off, of course, with this. It started off with this dawning realization that we had that all of the packaging companies that we deal with professionally all basically want to design this. And for hipster designers, this is really the platinum standard for sophistication. This is sophisticated packaging design. It doesn't get much more sophisticated than that. And of course, we see this in a wide range of categories. We work in milk, in light beer, in toothpaste, in confectionery, and in every single one of those categories, we worked with design companies who showed up with design prototypes basically looking like this. Toothpaste that looked like this, milk that looked like this, light beer based on this idea, snack food, potato chips that look like this. And you could tell the designers are all so excited with themselves because it's so sleek and minimalist and cool and sophisticated and, you know, achingly beautiful. And the issue, of course, is that while the designers see that, when you show it to respondents, what they see is this. They see generic, they see plain, they see undesigned. Zero effort put into something like that at all. It's the opposite of sophistication. This was somebody's bored 8-year-old son who was messing around on the computer one day and didn't know how to hit the color keys, and so came up with something like that. So this posed for us a real client management problem, and ultimately was a consumer insight problem, because this was really a juggernaut. Well, juggernaut is an unmovable force that comes from Indian religion. That's loggerheads. Thank you. That's what I was looking for. Loggerheads. Clients love the white. Consumers are contemptuous. You're like, white. There's clearly nothing going on there. So how, as researchers, are we to explain that? Both perfectly valid perspectives coming to each other's. There's obviously something complicated going on there which we needed to kind of get to the bottom of. So we started to think about white. How could something as simple as white be so divisive? So first of all, we looked at what we call the cultural etymology of white. what is the cultural etymology of a color like white? So you start with the natural world, of course, where you see that in the natural world, pure white is actually quite rare. The world is a colorful place, and it's a dirty, colorful place as well. Things get dirty very quickly. And the natural world establishes a very early dichotomy, or a binary opposition, between clean and unclean. This goes back thousands of years. And this has an immediate moral or value judgment associated with it. Dirty are things that are literally covered in shit. If you have shit on something, then you are dirty. And there is a moral implication for that. If you are clean of shit, if you are shit-free, then you are elevated, and you are, of course, clean, and you are white. And this plays out in most Asian cultures. I had 3 slides on all the Asian cultures, because once you go down this rabbit hole, man, it's hard to come out of it. But basically, to summarize, in Asian cultures, for instance, in India, white is the color of the highest Brahmin caste. But also, in India means that you have not spent your life working in the fields. If you work in the fields in India, you are dark, because the sun burns you to a crisp. And if you are privileged and you have enough money not to work in the fields, then you tend to get a little whiter. Incidentally, this plays out today with a multi-million-dollar whitening industry in contemporary China, where Indians pay an extraordinary amount of money for creams that they will put on their faces and hands to actually whiten their skin so they can actually look whiter, which has implications that I can't even start to talk about at the moment anyway. This is true also in Japanese culture and in Chinese culture. It's the color of death, of mourning. It, of course, is the color of rice, so it's a building block of life. It's also the color of self-illumination, of transcendence, of serenity. Apparently the color of the Buddhist's palm is white, apparently, if you are inclined to connect colors like that. And it also plays out in Western culture, so there's connotations of holiness, of redemption, of sacrifice, of sanctity. This is true from the Celts to the Judeo-Christian tradition. So there are some druids at Stonehenge dressed in very traditional white outfits. And then I believe this is Saul doing some sacrificing at the altar, dressed in white, of course, with white in the background. In more recent history, we have 3 primary connotations. There is, of course, surrender. This goes back for years and years. I think 1st century AD China was the first recorded interest of waving a white flag for surrender. And it's been since codified into the Geneva Conventions. If you wave a white flag and then get shot after that, then Geneva's going to come after you. They take a very, very dim view of that. But also virginity, which is why it's still the favorite color for wedding dresses, including what looks to me like Kim Kardashian in the middle there, which has got to be like the most satisfying, juicy joke you could ever hope to make. But regardless, maybe she's making some kind of point about irony. But clearly white has purity and virginity involved with it. And then also, of course, simplicity. Although for us, this is the tough one, it's most germane. But when you look into why white communicates simplicity, the world tends to get a bit quiet. There's not a lot of explanation for why white means simple, and we came to the conclusion that for most lines of inquiry, this is just considered a self-evident truth. You don't have to ask why. It's white, for God's sakes. Of course it's simple. There's nothing more simple than white. Not very helpful. So then we went to science. And science was a little bit more illuminating. See what I did there? Light illuminating. It explains that white is actually the combination of all colors. So if you reverse this image, you see how white works. You actually need to take the whole spectrum, and when you put the whole spectrum together, you actually get white light, which is why everything that is around us is actually a combination of all of those things. And that first started to hint at the complexity that goes on with white, because spectrographically, it's actually very complex. And this is very interesting academically, but not very helpful at all in a commercial sense. Because this is nonsense to a consumer, the person on the street. They will tell you with absolute confidence that white is the absence of all color, and that black is the presence of all colors. You can tell they're kind of imagining about a pot of paint. If you mix all the colors in a big pot of paint, you'll get brown, of course, but it'll be much closer to black. And if you take everything away, you're going to get white. It's actually the exact opposite of what science tells us is true spectrographically about the colors. Because black is actually the absence of everything, including color. So, that wasn't super helpful. We again found ourselves asking that question. How did the simplicity of white come to connote complexity Because when you go into nature, no one would argue that a white daisy is complex. It actually stands as a great symbol for simplicity, and they're pretty much as white as it gets. So, the answer, of course, comes from technology. Technology is the difference between these two ideas. One is technology, one is not. Why does technological white simplicity connote complexity? And that's because in technology, white is a construction. It's a decision. Somebody has to say, yes, I know, I'm going to make it white. It requires no effort to make it any other color. I could have any color I wanted. They are all at my fingertips. But I am going to decide to make it white. There is a self-referentiality to white, a self-consciousness about white. And that, we believe, is one of the reasons why designers love it. And of course, some of you are designers and you can speak to that. The irony of white is part of the appeal of white. That it's so complex, and you kind of have to know why white is not simple to appreciate how funny it is that white actually connotes simplicity. So here was the idea. The idea is that technology, of course, gets increasingly complicated. Every year it gets more and more complex. But the more complicated the technology gets, the more the UI, the user interface, has to be seamless, has to be simple. Because it's already at a state where you can't possibly conceive how complicated something as simple as your phone is. Right? Here's this thing we carry around in our pockets, mind-bogglingly complex in whatever how many millimeters we've got to work there. But it doesn't matter, because we never have to engage with that. We engage with the UI, and as long as that's simple, and as long as that's seamless, we don't give a shit how it actually works on the inside. The ultimate goal of UI is transparency. You should not even notice it's there. You want to know what the capital of Brazil is, you just basically say into Siri, what's the capital of Brazil? And Siri gives you the answer, which of course 15 years ago would be so unconceivably complicated that it kind of boggles the imagination. The color of transparency is white. And designers, my understanding is, speaking to them, they love this idea, because of course it is nonsense. We all know, and even the users of phones know that our phones are complicated. On some level, you're aware of how complicated these things are. And we make this decision that we're not going to let that bother us because we have this white simplicity to engage with, and as long as that gives us what we want, why is there's no point in going any much deeper than that. In the artificial, modern, mediated world, white is the color of untouched but limitless potential. And here's paper. We were talking about books earlier. There is, of course, always the danger that paper is becoming archaic. I don't actually believe that's true. I think paper is around to stay. However, it's always kind of threatened with being archaic. We still believe, though, that in spite of how technological people are getting, that white in paper form still represents the tabula rasa. It's still a blank slate. White is the color of beginnings. It's the color of emptiness that's waiting for your personality to come along and make an impression on it. It's the color of a limitless potential because in its state at the moment, there are no restrictions to where that can go. It can go in any direction. It can accommodate any idea. It is limited by absolutely nothing. But that's only true when it's purely white. Because the moment you put even a single mark, or a single stroke, or a single color onto that piece of paper, immediately you start restricting yourself. You start locking yourself into particular paths, particular approaches, and the more you put into white, of course, the more limited your potentials become. So the perfect state is this, because that then could mean anything, and of course also everything. The trouble with that idea was this, because then you look at things like this, which is a piece of white technology which does not connote sophistication. It's a plain white plastic prototype. It's precision machine. Clearly a lot of energy has been put into making this exactly the dimensions that it is, but it holds no mystery. There's no implied technology going on there. There's no aura of complexity to something like that. It's just a very cleverly machined bit of white plastic. So then, of course, we had to think about it even more. And then ultimately, we actually had this as an insight. It's actually, white is not about white. It's actually about covering black with white. That's actually what's going on. And that really means it's about the dichotomy of black and white. It's about the binary opposition of black versus white. It's about the admittedly Western cultural symbolism that black and white carry with them. And it's about the spatial implications of inside versus outside. Because except for one notable exception, which I'll have to tell you about as a sidebar because I love it, and I love it because it's the exception to this rule. Apart from that exception, the way the code works is black is on the inside and white is on the outside, always. We have black interiors, and then we coat that black with white armor most of the time. Such an exciting idea. Okay, great. We thought, oh yeah, now we're really getting somewhere. So then it became the market proof. We're like, okay, wow, we have this terrific idea. How do we now demonstrate that in contemporary Western culture, the specific semiotic code that allows white to communicate technological sophistication is a very specific, very layered spatial relationship between black interiors and all of the complexity that a black interior connotes, covered with white exteriors, which is a really specific idea to have to kind of play out in market research. But of course, the truth is it was dead simple. It's science fiction. Technology design has always been driven and inspired by science fiction since arguably the 19th century. That's another rabbit hole you can go down to. What is the definition of science fiction? What is the first piece of science fiction? And of course, we found some scholars who argued quite vehemently that Gilgamesh should be considered science fiction, because at the time, that was speculative fiction, was Gilgamesh. I mean, come on, as you can see, it's not real, and it's like a fantasy, and anyway, we decided to let Gilgamesh go, and we decided we were going to have the 19th century as kind of our starting point. And from that point on, science fiction authors, writers, artists have really been a driver for design and a driver for technology. We actually decided we didn't even need to go back to the 19th century. We decided we would go back to 1968. Because our clients can only take so much. We think that 1968 was probably a nice epoch to kind of start with something a little bit more contemporary. So let me take you through what some of those look like, and you can figure out for yourselves whether it all adds up. This is where the movie quiz part starts to come, and I'm sure you've all read the abstract, so you kind of know what's coming. The title is From Star Wars to iPad or iPod packaging. Really, it should be from 2001, because of course this is 68. Here is the EVA pod from Discovery 1, which is the spaceship in 2001. How many of you have not seen 2001: A Space Odyssey? Have you all seen that?
Yes.
Shame. No? Haven't seen it?
I've
3
seen
times.
parts of it, but not the whole movie.
Yeah, you know, that's actually not such a bad counter, because there are parts of that that would benefit from some editing, I would argue, totally. Although, you know, I've read somewhere that Kubrick said that the long, boring parts of the movie were deliberate because space is a very long, boring proposition to consider, and of course he was one of the early pure science, hard science filmmakers, and there's been a very rare science fiction movie since 1968 that doesn't succumb to the need to fill the vacuum of space with sound. Which is why there's always explosions in space, which Kubrick knew was nonsense, because there's no air in space. If there's no air, there can be no sound. So space is soundless. There's a great TV series on at the moment called The Expanse. Do any of you know that? And The Expanse is really interesting. It's 4 or 5 episodes. And although they've succumbed to having the laser sounds in space, pew, 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 for most of it, things happen silently in space. And then there was that Sandra Bullock movie, Gravity, which is also, a lot of the scenes that happen in space are, quite correctly, soundless. But it's a little jarring to have soundlessness in space. It's kind of weird because we just kind of expect that oral soundscape. Anyway, Kubrick, 1968, got it right. Everything in space, completely soundless, correctly. This is a pod that is responsible for one of the death of the astronauts in 2001, which is essentially about a sentient computer that goes psychotic and tries to kill all of the people in the spaceship and almost succeeds. And it has these arms in front, which is responsible for killing one of the astronauts. The whole production design of the movie is based around this general aesthetic. And you can see now how this starts to play out. It's black on the inside, and it's sheathed in white on the outside. because this is a microcosm symbol of the character of Hal 9000 in the movie, and really the whole point of the movie itself. Hal has this surface which is very banal, very accommodating. He speaks in this kind of disturbing monotone. I'm sure
Douglas
you've heard
Raines.
the voice.
Yeah,
Sorry?
it was Douglas Raines.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
classic sound
Oh,
design.
gosh,
And
yes.
I'm sorry, I can't do that, Hal. I mean, I've got a bad Hal imitation. You really have to hear it. It's quite unlike anything else. So lovely and white and plain and innocuous on the outside, but inside, he's psychotic, right? And he's going to kill you, because that's what he's decided he needs to do to preserve the mission. And most of the second half of the movie is all about exactly that tension. Black heart, black soul, white exterior. For me, this is the big one, quite honestly. So this was really 1977. I was, a boy at the time when this came out, and I'd be hard pressed to tell you what an impression the design of this movie made on me as a nascent semiotician. It was really quite extraordinary, because even at 10 years old, which is how old I was when this came out, I was mildly surprised that the bad guys could wear white, because that's not correct. I even knew at that age that the good guys had black hats, and the bad guys had black hats, and the good guys wore white hats. I mean, white and black is good and evil, and that's the way it worked. So in the opening scenes, when the stormtroopers burst through the door of Tanta Ford, start shooting at the good guys, and they're dressed in white, that was quite mind-blowing. It's like, what are they getting at with that? That's really strange choice. But when you look at it closely, and of course then Darth Vader comes in through the door, he's dressed in black, and then your equilibrium's restored. It's like, oh, okay, he's the really bad guy, and he's black all the way through. He's like, couldn't be more black. But these guys are supposed to be bad. But of course, they're black underneath. That's the point of the stormtrooper outfit. If you took off the actual armor plating, they'd be in black one-piece unitards or something, I presume. The white armor just sits on top of that. And that was a very interesting metaphor for the moral ambiguity of stormtroopers, and of course of soldiers, is not being entirely black or being entirely white. Darth Vader can be entirely black, because it took us 3 movies to get to the point where we realized that maybe there was a little bit of white in him that could be saved. In that first film, man, he was absolutely rotten to the core. But these are just ground troops. These are people who have families to go back to, presumably. So there's this interplay between white and black, which makes them morally complex, morally engaging. It's kind of interesting. And then we start to get into homages and references for those 2 movies. Everything that happens since 1977, in most cases, has to pay tribute to either 2001 or Star Wars or both. Because that double punch movie was so influential in establishing this particular code that it's very difficult to wade into science fiction design without some kind of awareness that this is established. So everything, of course, plays out from here. This is a 1997 music video for Bjork. Do you familiar with this video, any of you? Or this song? Yeah, it's a terrific song. I've got the whole thing on the flash drive. I'm only going to play you a minute of it, which already is pretty indulgent, and it's not the full song. But you need at least a minute to sort of appreciate what's going on here. If you beg afterwards, maybe we'll put the whole thing on. You can watch all 4 minutes of it, because it's really quite lovely. But this is, at the time, very influential and, again, award-winning video. the white. It's black, but there's certainly some complexity there, I would argue, unfathomable complexity on what kind of artificial intelligence needs to exist within the black under the white. So that dichotomy of complexity and simplicity very much playing out here. And then Wall-E came along in 2008, and this character is Eve. Again, a very carefully chosen name for her. She is the probe droid that's sent down to the planet that Wall-E is actually on. And here we start to see some more overt self-consciousness about this relationship between white and the complexity. So this is a quote from the director. The director, Andrew Stanton, said, "I wanted Eve to be high-end technology, no expense spared, and I wanted it to be seamless, and for the technology to be sort of hidden and subcutaneous," which is a lovely, physical, human word to apply to a droid. It's a perfect design for this particular character, particularly in comparison with Wall-E. And here is Wall-E. Because in the movie, how many of you have not seen Wall-E? You guys are doing really well. Just add it to your list. It'll be fine. Wall-E is a lovely film. So Wall-E is stuck on Earth. Wall-E is a garbage compactor, which incidentally means that Wall-E is hollow. Big empty space inside of Wall-E. There's nothing to Wall-E. Wall-E is absolutely simple, no sophistication or complexity about Wall-E, either mechanically or emotionally. He's an absolute lovely flatline. He's lovely, but he's a flatline. Eve, however, is complex. She has a mission, she has a hidden mission. She's knowledgeable of the ways of the world, she has knowledge of good and evil, which of course is why she's called Eve. That's the point of calling her Eve. She has depth, she's sophisticated, she's got a temper, she gets frustrated very early, and there's scenes in the movie where she gets pissed off at things and starts blowing up things at random just because she's getting pissed off at her lack of success, and she's getting a little irritated at Wall-E kind of falling in love with her. But all of that sophistication and complexity is in the black that's hidden by the white. So the white is on the outside, clean and kind of seamless. Then District 9 was the next one that came along. Again, I won't keep asking because you're obviously all very movie literate, so if you haven't seen it, add that to your list because again, it's a classic. 2009. Again, the bad guy is wearing white once more. So this is one of the uniforms on the left-hand side there is the military consultants from MNU, Multinational United. And they are speciest, and they are out to beat up the alien race, which is the underclass of Johannesburg in this particular film. But at least in the movie, their white armor is scuffed and dirty, which is a little bit of a change. It rarely gets scuffed and dirty in a lot of these movies, and at least in this one, they started off white, but because it's Johannesburg, which is basically a slum in the course of this film, they're all kind of messed up and dirty and scuffed. What's interesting about the design of white in District 9 is on the right-hand side here are some pictures of the alien weapons that come out of that. And of course, they follow the same idea. They're also cloaked or sheathed in white armor, which is a very interesting color choice given the relationship between the aliens and the humans in District 9. Because in the movie, the aliens in District 9 are portrayed as very unsophisticated, very simple, very one-note creatures. They don't have a lot of speech, they live in slums, they barely have any clothes, they've lost all kind of sense of government or self-organization. They basically live like pack animals in the slums. But there is the narrative in this film that they once had greater heights when they had interstellar space travel, and that they've fallen from those heights for some inexplicable reason, virus or whatever. And these are relics from their glory days. These are weapons from when they were a power to be reckoned with. And so the white armor on top of the black complexity is a very interesting visual metaphor for exactly what that relationship used to be. Guns, of course, are a perfect example of something that can be very beautiful on the outside from a design perspective, but inside they're pure evil. Nothing more evil than a gun. It's designed to kill people or to kill things. So the black is underneath, and then the white, of course, is just sheathed on top. We have Tron Legacy. turned up in 2010. Same kind of story, very long gestating sequel. Some of my friends aren't too crazy about Tron Legacy. I think it's a great film. I love this film. It's maybe not the best story in the world, but the production design of Tron Legacy is just so gorgeous to immerse yourself in. If you have a decent TV screen with a good resolution, just have this on loop in the background and marvel at the design of it. This is a minor character. She's one of the software programs who initially outfits the hero in his outfit, and then later on in the film effects a minor betrayal. She brings the bad guys to the door, and there's this moment where the main character goes, "Oh, but I thought you were so cute before, and you were kind of flirting with me with your computer eyes, and now I realize you're working for the man." And of course she's dressed in white, and then all of her black, evil software-ness is all, of course, hidden on the inside. Then we have Prometheus. Again, Ridley Scott in 2012. Design went into Prometheus is fascinating. All Ridley Scott films, of course, are just beautifully designed. Nothing that's badly designed in any Ridley Scott film ever, particularly his science fiction stuff. He's got such an incredible design team behind him. So this is an engineer. You all seen Prometheus, I hope? Most of you get the idea of it? Okay, so, good. So there's one you guys can add to your homework. Because Prometheus, again, has its flaws, but absolutely worth seeing. This is the opening sequence where this is a character known as an engineer. And the engineers are, well, they're mysterious. The whole film ends kind of unsatisfyingly. You're not really supposed to know who an engineer is or what the role of the engineers are. But they're established as demigods within the mythology of this film. Exactly the nature of their demigodry is a little unclear, but they are creators of life. And so they're alabaster white. Semiotically, I believe they're designed to evoke Greek statuary. They're basically supposed to look like Greek gods. And the close-up of their skin when you see the film makes them very much like they're literally carved out of marble, kind of moving marble. They're not missing their arms like some Greek statuary, but there they are. And the bad guy in the film, the narrative of the film, is a genetic mutation which lives in liquid. And here is a drop of this liquid on the tip of a finger. And what happens, of course, is you ingest this genetically modified liquid, and it fucks you up badly. It does all sorts of horrible things to you. And there's all sorts of really gruesome scenes in Prometheus where you either deliberately ingested it or accidentally ingested it, and all sorts of science fiction horror emerges out of that. And in this opening scene, this engineer actually consumes some of this black liquid and then jumps into this waterfall and disintegrates into DNA strands, presumably to then populate the genetic code of a whole planet. Although nobody really knows what the hell's going on in the first opening scenes of Prometheus, but that's kind of the idea. The dichotomy is the same, though. The black is evil, and it's on the inside. And then the whiteness, the power of it, is very much on the outside. I think, finally, we end our movie references with Episode 7, Force Awakens, which is, of course, like the whole movie, just a rehash of what the original Star Wars was all about, but they did that very well. So sexy, the helmet designs. I mean, if you love the original Stormtrooper design, which I did, they came out with this, and all of us kind of got goosebumps when we saw how wonderful it is. And they really seem to be conscious of the notion of white floating on top of black here. Because in the original Stormtrooper outfit, you could tell that white was on top of black, but it was a little awkward back in the day. Here now it kind of sits seamlessly on top of the black, and with the close-up you can even get the lovely carbon fiber details of the black. So here there's even an enhanced sense of the complexity that's going on in the black underneath the white. The white is always spotless. The ultimate bad guy Stormtrooper is Captain Phasma, and she's gone the next step up because her armor is chrome, so it sparkles. It actually reflects light out. It's the whole next step up. We'll leave movies, but just to give you a sense that it's not just a movie code as well, I'll give you just one quick example of how this actually plays out in non-movie technology. Here is the 2008 concept for Land Rover's LRX, which several years later came out as the Evoque in 2011, 99.9% unchanged from the prototype. And for the first 6 months of Land Rover advertising for the Evoque, it was always shown in white. You never saw any advertising for it in any other color. After 6 months, they kind of played it out a bit because people started to see different colors on the streets. But when this car was launched, this was the color of it. It was their brand new high-tech flagship SUV, and there was this clearly conscious semiotic decision that white was going to be the color of the Evoque. Because all of the black is on the inside, where you sit, incidentally, because you're evil, we all know that. But you can be sheathed in white protection, and all that white is now going to be on the outside of you. So, that I think brings us back quite cleanly to the iPhone, where essentially that's what's going on with this. The iPhone 6, of course, has kind of a silver background, which always irritated me, so I went and bought a pure white background, because if I'm going to have white and black, I'm going to go white and black and not mess around with Captain Phasma Silver, which is why that's a slight adaptation. But it's very much that idea. It's really not so much about the white. It's really got to do with the black that's inside the white. But in true dichotomy binary opposition form, the black on the inside only has meaning when it's contrasted with the white on the outside. Because that's the way the binary oppositions work. One only has meaning when you have the other. If you don't have one, you can't have the other. And we know that this is hugely successful. For starters, you can look at Apple's financial success, but you can also look at things like Google's first entry into the smartphone, which is the Nexus 1. And here is the packaging for the Nexus 1, which incidentally covers a phone which has no white in it at all. The Nexus 1 is an entirely black phone. So you open up this blindingly white packaging to find a black phone on the inside. Perfect example of how that dichotomy works. And then, last slide, just to bring it back to the absolute beginning, in a nice, beautiful, tidy, clean circle as far as the talk goes. I mentioned earlier that the Xbox logo that we looked at was the logo at the time, because at the time that was true. Those of you who are gamers will probably know they have since changed their logo, and the Xbox logo now looks like that. Which of course is a little bit different. They don't maybe quite have the black inside, they still have the neon green vagina dentata ghost in the machine, but the idea of course is still very much there. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to say, I really enjoyed the talk. I'm going to have to go and take a portion of your audience with me.
Yes,
because
I know.
we have a class to run, but
yeah.
I've got a burning question. So, your method sort of seems to presume a commutability between the decoding of these stories and the encoding of them deliberately in the packages that you work on with your clients.
Yes.
And what I'm wondering is if multiple kind of contradictory explanations are possible for how and why something reads semiotically as an artifact, how can you be sure that you are encoding the message or the sub-message that you want to when you're going back in the other direction?
Absolutely.
I mean, I can see how you can tell the story, but it seems like, and I say this with sympathy, by the way, because as a futurist, you know, I'm very well familiar with the kind, with the kind of skepticism that can come. Well, you're working in a speculative mode. How can you possibly justify this? So I'm not. I don't mean this to sound as critical or pokey as it might.
No,
but I'm curious. I can see how you can mount that as a story.
Yeah.
But how do you justify the conceit or the premise that you're encoding things on the design side such that they will be decoded as you intend?
No, absolutely. So for us, it actually ends up being quite a straightforward question to address. Given the commercial or the marketing perspective that we are obliged to take and that all this takes, one of the fundamental tenets to that, and it's something we actually present very early to clients as part of the process, when we introduce them to the semiotic process, we explain to them that encoding, decoding is, we have a great slide in one of our decks which has this lovely 19th century picture of information coming from one etched brain kind of into the other brain. But the perspective that market research semioticians have to take as qualitative researchers is that only the decoding counts. And that for something to be decoded, it has to be encoded, but that as far as the consumer is concerned, the intent of the author has to be irrelevant. Because we feel that from a marketing perspective, what people see in something is the only truth or reality that matters. And if that aligns with the intent of the designer, that's lovely for the designer. But if it doesn't, then there's not much that the client can actually do with that. And when we present this to designers, of course, we soften that language considerably. We're quite apologetic with it. We say, you know, guys, we hate to tell you this, because this is tough news for you as far as consumer research goes. But the trick for doing this research for you as designers is to give you feedback on all of the ways that your encoding can be, or could be, or has been decoded, so that you can then use that information to more accurately recalibrate your encoding, or maybe go in kind of different directions. And of course that works in the marketing community because ultimately the end goal is what are the consumers going to take out of it. If for whatever reason we had to step beyond that, for us that step would be the step away from market proof into more academic proof. That's what would then tell us, well, we can't just throw market proof, because all of that market proof is all popular culture. It's like this is the milieu that people swim in, and that's actually culturally the sources that they will receive, that they'll take from in order to make their interpretation. We know that white means this because we know that 17 million people saw Star Wars on their opening weekend, and if you saw that movie, you would have to be impacted by that kind of relationship. However, there are 17 different other ways that you could possibly interpret that. And if you really needed to know the statistical significance of that, then we go into quant. And let's take it to quant, and let's do a quant survey and find out with statistical significance which of those potential decodings is actually the one that's relevant, so that you can get a sense of whether you're far off the beam or not. And quite honestly, quant is about as close to academic proof as our clients can get, because throwing a 3-math square at them, we've tried that, it doesn't stick, it doesn't work, they just have no idea. Does that answer the question?
I think it does, yeah. Thank you.
Yes?
You want to decode my BlackBerry? How about it?
Blackberry.
Yeah, because
Yes.
of course it is far from white. It's very black by nature and name. And it's very different from an iPhone.
Yes.
And it's on the way out.
Yep.
What do you got to say?
Well, yeah, you're very welcome, my pleasure. This is your BlackBerry here?
That's my BlackBerry.
Very good, very interesting.
It's the new one. It's not the Priv, but it's as new as you can get.
So the BlackBerry, yeah, no problem, you're very welcome. Thank you. The BlackBerry, of course, is fascinating because the BlackBerry actually serves to support a lot of that analysis, in opposition by the reverse. So part of BlackBerry's challenge has always been user interface. One of the reasons why they had some very early success is they were quite sophisticated in providing a whole bunch of tools. And their fall from grace, I would argue, started when the simplicity of Apple's user interface started to show people how simple, in fact, these things could be.
Yeah.
And part of the appeal of a BlackBerry to BlackBerry users has always been the QWERTY keyboard.
Oh, sure.
Right,
That's why I bought it.
Yeah, exactly.
I can't use that darn
Right.
on-screen keyboard.
And so BlackBerry's argument has always been, we are a serious business tool. And so that means we are more interested in raw computing power and functionality,
Yeah.
and less concerned about making it look pretty, or making it look easy, or making it look fast, or making it look simple. We want to give you real muscle in your pocket, and if that's a little awkward to deal with, we don't care about that because we don't think you care about that. So we're going to give you a QWERTY keyboard which you can bash, which you can mess around with, and which is visually is kind of ugly because it's got to serve multiple purposes. And of course early models had the flywheel in the middle, which you have to kind of,
I never
get
saw
your
that.
kind of thumb into. And in the back you have this carbon fiber look, which is also quite complex. So there's a complexity here, which is meant to mirror the complexity within. But BlackBerry, the complexity is all on the surface. And increasingly, the way that smartphones go is the smarter part of smartphone rather than the phone part of the phone part.
Yeah.
And of course, smartness here is they want, so BlackBerry wants you to do the work with the phone.
It does,
Apple wants the phone to do the work for you,
yeah.
which is why you can cover it with white, and then that's a perfect metaphor for your lack of emotional investment in the mechanics of it.
It's like the difference between Word and WordPerfect.
Oh, yes.
WordPerfect is so simple. Everybody I know who's ever encountered it loves it and hates Word because it's so controlling. Word does the work for you. I don't want Word to do the work for me.
Yeah.
All right, I won't go on, but you know what I mean.
Very much.